Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining us today from deep in the heart of Texas is Thomas B. Mack, author of The Lead Mine Men, the enduring 45th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Tom, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me, Chris.
Delighted to have you with us. Delighted to have your book as part of our Engaging the Civil War series with Southern Illinois University Press. And first of all, we'll get into some regimental level history here, which is always kind of fun because you got just personalities. But
Sure.
what attracted your attention to the 45th Illinois in the first place?
Well, way back in grad school, my first seminar, and they were grateful at the University of North Texas to let me do a seminar on something outside of the South. So I decided to focus on the Civil War as my research area. Being grown up in Springfield, Illinois, with all the Lincoln history there, and I said, let me try to let's see what Illinois regiments, right, I could do. And I wanted one that had fought in a lot of the major battles in the Western Theater. So I just started looking at Dyer's Compendium and going down, from the 1st Illinois Regiment and infantry. And I see the Washburn Lead Mine Regiment, that's a cool name, and 45th Illinois. And, Dyer got a few things wrong. They did serve in the Atlanta campaign, but not, any of the battles. They guarded a bridge, but little things there. But I said, hey, Shiloh and Vicksburg and Atlanta, then March to the Sea, and it's a great, they cover a lot of the areas I want to cover. And then I read Wilbur Crummer's account of his 2 years with the 45th, with Grant, Donelson and Shiloh and Vicksburg, and I read of, wow, they helped dig this mine, and then they volunteer to serve, to charge into the crater, after the rent by the explosion of the mine, and
and we're talking here in Vicksburg.
Yes, I'm sorry, at Vicksburg. So they fight through they fight at Donelson, Shiloh. They start on the campaign. They fight well, in at least 3 of the battles. Once they land south of Vicksburg, at Thompson's Hill and at it's escaping me now. I'm not sure, Raymond. They didn't fight much at again, it's escaping me again. But then they fought well at Champions Hill, charged up the hill with the rest of Logan's division.
Yeah, they were they come to the battlefield at Jackson, I think is what you're talking about.
Yes, Jackson. Sorry, Jackson, yeah, they get to
later.
Jackson, but it's a quick battle, and they were in the reserve. They have to scatter because some bullets hit all these beehives, and that was like the most danger they faced at Jackson. But they do well at Champion Hill, and then at the major attack, at Vicksburg on the 19th, right? I believe May 19th, 63. Yep. And do well, lose their major to a bullet. They fight, can't break through like the rest of Grant's soldiers that day, and they dig into the siege, and they're doing sharpshooter work, and they're resting in camp, help digging Logan's approach, the sap towards the 3rd Louisiana Redan. They take part in all that work, and then of course they help because a lot of lead miners. So the regiment's name was 45th, but they call themselves the Washburn Lead Mine Regiment, partially because there was a lot of lead mining in Galena, Illinois, where they first formed, at the Joe Davis Fairgrounds, right there in Galena. A lot of their officers were friends with Grant. Rowley and Rawlins were both officers in the 45th before Grant plunked them out. Later, he plucked out their surgeon, so I have all this history, right? And I met with Grant, and so they call themselves the Lead Mine Regiment because of all the lead mine. At one point, they led the nation in this tiny little town in Illinois, led the nation in iron ore mining, more rich than Chicago in 1840, 42. So, pretty cool name, Lead Mine Regiment. And then Elihu Washburn, congressman from that district of Illinois, benefactor to Grant, political, buddy of Lincoln, helps Grant throughout the war, but also helped get the 45th Enfield rifles. And I believe, only 5 other Illinois regiments in 1861 had Enfields. great equipment, great uniforms. So they honor Washburn by calling themselves Washburn Lead Mine Regiment. So back to Vicksburg, they General Logan, his old regiment, the 31st Illinois, refused to lead the attack after the mine is all ready, and that morning, and he comes to the 45th, and paraphrasing, but 45th never refuse an order that I've given them. Will you lead the attack? And they volunteer. They suffer horrendous losses, worst of any regiment that fought in the crater, and much, just reading a book on the Petersburg crater, and the size of the Petersburg crater and all the men, and at Vicksburg is just much smaller. They had 2 companies, maybe 100 men at most, could fit into this crater fighting, and unfortunately, no drunken officers like at Petersburg, no failure of command. They just didn't dig this mine far enough west to cover this new line of fortifications. So it fails. They lose their whole command staff to either mortal wounds, killed in action, or serious wound. And because of this, General McPherson, the leader of the 17th Corps, goes to Grant and says, "I want the 45th to lead your army into Vicksburg." This is on July 4th, once Pemberton surrenders. And I read all of this, and I'm like, well, this is a great story, So I write a bunch of seminar papers on it, trying to fill in chapters, all that's about. And then begin the dissertation. And I assume this is like most people, especially their first and their dissertation. I was just fortunate to find enough sources, did a lot of medical, research at the archives in Washington, D.C., and get the dissertation done in a very hectic 2015. And I didn't think it would take 9 years for my book to get published, but did a lot more research, did a lot of rewriting, just learning, to be a better writer, better historian, and thankfully I'm here.
Well, that sounds like a story as exciting and convoluted as the story of the regiment itself. Your story,
Yes,
getting
yes, yes.
the project to press.
I mean, it's what I learned, about the soldiers obviously was that yes, you hear about Jackson's, walking cavalry, right, and how they no shoes and the cold weather and all of that. But every soldier experienced it, maybe not to the constant level, but these Union soldiers did it, on the retreat, on Grant's first campaign, and the lice, and the biggest thing I found is that yes, great, the Union leadership says we're going to do this hard war on the Confederacy, right? Destroy their industry, destroy their economy, take all their food, make life really hard on them. And what you really find is it made life a lot harder on the Union men as well, not just to periods of starvation, and periods of foraging can sometimes provide a lot of bounty, and a lot of times it didn't. But also as they do, Sherman starts going wide and wider, to try to forage and destroy at Meridian, and then march to the sea in the Carolinas. It also experienced these men to a lot more, the dark side of the war, captured by the Confederates, having to be shipped to Andersonville or just killed outright, for all their foraging. So, war is hell on these soldiers as well, even though they were better supplied and had more food on general than the Confederates. So, obviously really came to respect, their service, obviously.
Now, when did they enter into the war? Like, when did they muster together as the 45th from a state that sent, more than 100 regiments?
Sure. They originally Washburn tried to get an order for the regiment in May and in early June, and of course this is before Bull Run and how much men the Union realized they needed. So men kept coming into the fairgrounds in Galena, enlisting, but not officially, but starting to serve, and people started, some other people came in. But it was in July after Bull Run when Washburn had a lot of pull and worked with the Department of the War and got the authorization. And then Johnny Smith, who was a jeweler, he ran a jewelry store in Galena, friends with Grant, was helping to drill and organize men down in Springfield. And he got the colonelcy. And then, that's when, enlistments and the drive really started all across, mostly from, those top counties in the northern part of Illinois. The competition was fierce for men, and then, so they're drilling. They're starting to get their equipment and uniforms and getting their colors, and all the way through the fall. And then in November, they're moved to Camp Douglas in Illinois, and they're eventually paired up with a county out of Lake County, Illinois, a company Lake County, Illinois, and then a couple more from the Quad Cities area of Illinois, farther south on the western border, and got their 10 regiments, and then were officially mustered into service in late December of '61.
And so that's a lot of time before you finally get out there and onto the front there. I mean, 6 months to kind of get
And
yourselves organized. How do they
right,
use that time?
drilling, reading drill books. They did a lot of marching. In Camp Douglas, there was always somebody leaving and another regiment leaving, so they would all march with them. Just a ton of drilling, getting into some trouble in Chicago. At one point, they had to bring in these, they were called the mechanic fusiliers, I believe is how you pronounce it, who had helped build the camp, build all the barracks. Terrible barracks, really green wood. And eventually, once they dried, the joke was they could see just as well through the cracks in the wood than the windows in the barracks. But of course, not great in cold Chicago. At one point, they were called out to bring these rioting men because they didn't get paid as much, tearing down the fence of the camp and all of that. And they get brought back in the next night, more of those people do it, and the whole regiment has to bring them back. And as things go, supposedly in the Chicago papers, they were told that they were the ones writing, and Lieutenant Colonel Jasper Maltby, second in command, had to correct the papers. But because of their work, they get 3 rounds of applause, their first kind of honors, so to speak, in Chicago before they leave. And that's the one thing that I found is then they're practicing. They go down to Cairo, which I always say Cairo, even though I'm from Illinois, and it's all pronounced Cairo down there, but they get
And you
down
should know
there.
better being in Illinois.
I know. My family was giving me all kinds of static about it. But they get, Grant requests them to get down there even before they were fully mustered, fully, enlisted into service. But they're still practicing and drilling down there as well. So they really had most of the men had a good 5 to 6 months worth of drilling and practice. And the third in command, Malakhan, if that's how you pronounce it, Smith was the third in command, and he was a postmaster. He had done a lawyer and all of this, and he became a really excellent drill master. And the men hated him, even the officers hated him. But I think it served him well, especially the 6 months in service compared to, was it the 16th Connecticut that had like 2 weeks of training before they get thrown into Antietam, right? And the regiment's never the same. I mean, their regiment is just almost the complete opposite, and I think that really helped them, especially once they suffer a lot of losses, in the officer corps, especially, Johnny Smith gets promoted first to temporary division command in the Army of the Tennessee, and then he's their brigade commander, and then eventually goes off to division command and then corps command. But as these men get lost, like Jasper Maltby gets terribly injured during the attack in the Vicksburg crater, and kind of makes it out on some of the pre-Meridian raids in early 1864, but never really sees the field again. And really his death should be counted in the deaths because he died of internal injuries from that attack 2 years later. So they lose all these officers, but I think that the younger officers learned, had seen the fighting, and in much smaller actions, they constantly get pulled in to lead attacks. And here and there, it just seemed like they always were right there in the middle and always being called on to do things. So their younger officers did well, and learned, right? And obviously they're non-commissioned officers that got promoted up to lieutenant as well. So I think it really served them those 6 months in training.
What was the morale like for the men as they were spending their time getting ready to go off to war? Are they excited? Are they nervous? Are they bored? A
A lot
little
of
of all?
boredom, a
Yeah.
lot of boredom. It's funny, they had it pretty good in Galena. I think, like a lot of regiments, they got a lot of food brought to them. They saw some early parts of the war. They served as a funeral uh, uh, team, so to speak, for these men who had died in Indiana on a train heading to the front, and when a bridge collapsed, and from the Galena area, so from a different regiment. And so they see a little bit of the war and death, and all of that, but a lot of boredom, some tomfoolery, as officers or men will do when they're bored. But they're training quite a bit. When they get to Chicago, they're dealing with cold. They're dealing with much rougher situations. Um, and One of the first histories of the regiment, written by a former captain in the regiment, about 8 years after the war, he he jokes about, how they thought they had it rough in Galena when, it got cold early, or in Chicago, and then, to look back at that, they realize later that, oh my gosh, it's so much greater. So, but boredom quite a bit, especially once they get to Cairo. They hated the mud, and the conditions were pretty bad down there. And one of the lines was the fact that they realized a lot of animals had been living in the barracks prior to them getting there, and they're behind leaky dikes, for the Ohio and the Mississippi, and so they really wanted to get out of Cairo really quickly. But I think they soldiered on. I think they, um, again, thought they had it pretty bad, but I think they just kind of dealt with it. I think they were paid, in the most part, many were patriots. They didn't suffer a lot of desertions, handfuls, maybe 10 to 15 from the whole period, from the start of the regiment all the way through, before they go head south into Tennessee, and for Fort Donelson and all of that. So their desertion rate was incredibly low. I don't have the numbers. It was around 5%. And I think the average, I think maybe it was even lower than that, but much lower than the average for the Union Army, especially. So I think they were just made up with, a lot of tough men who survived and shouldered on. And I think because they earned a lot of praise, whether it was at Donelson or at Shiloh, winning a um, inspection for the 17th Corps while they're in Memphis, waiting to go down to rejoin the Vicksburg Campaign in late 1862, early 1863. I think those things has kind of given this esprit de corps that helped them to eventually volunteer for the dangerous attack at Vicksburg. And they just keep doing well to the point where they were able to carry on through the rest of the war.
It's funny when you mentioned they go to Cairo and they hate the mud, and like I don't think people fully realize how long Illinois is. And you
Yeah,
think about
yeah.
those bitter Chicago winters, but like when you get down to Cairo, you're practically in the South, you know?
Yeah, you're halfway in, the depth of Kentucky. They're because Kentucky starts going up, and so yeah, they're pretty far. And of course, they didn't like the Southern Illinois men. They were all, of course, they were back then. Illinois, from Springfield, or maybe a little even north of Springfield, was Whig, then Republican, and Springfield on south was very Democrat. They didn't like the Egyptians. At one point, I heard there was rumors that they were going to be merged with the Southern Illinois, a regiment from Southern Illinois, and the men don't want to be associated with those Egyptians, is what they said. So, but they really didn't mention it too much there, at least what the records I had. I think I think when they were ready prior to going south and joining the war, they did what a lot of men did. They, some officers bought insurance policies. They rode home. They got stuff to make sure they could ride home, and they just prepared. They were very, like you say, what was their anticipation for battle? Well, as they're marching down to Fort Henry and wanting to attack, and the Union Navy, ironclads, got to surrender before they got there. Half the men were, irked that they didn't get a chance, disappointed they didn't get a chance to fight. Well, then they fight at Donelson and see death and see the carnage of battle, and like we don't look forward to battle anymore, as far as, oh, it's just going to be this great contest, right? And obviously that's similar to how many thousands, millions of men, right, who
Right.
fought on both sides.
Yeah. So, they take part in the Henry and Donaldson campaign. Then they go to Shiloh. How do they do there?
So it was interesting. All the books I read on Shiloh focus on the Hornet's Nest, right? They focus on the initial attack and how all these regiments and Sherman's division and others, just are streaming and cowering at at Pittsburgh Landing, and all these accounts they talk a little bit, but then all from that first day of battle, they all shift to Hornet's Nest, to the middle part of the battle and the southern part. I guess if you're looking, at a map, and they don't focus a lot on what happens with Sherman's men or McClernand's men when they were in McClernand's division, and they do well. They form up to battle. Once cannonballs start flying, they really realize, okay, this is the attack that they were expecting. They form up. They brace for, and again, happens in a lot of battles. They don't fire first at the attacking Confederates because their officers like, no, it looks like Union men, don't fire on them. It looks like Union men coming back. So, but they fight well, but they have to retreat. They retreat. Sherman gets over there, a lot of his men and McClernand, and there's a couple of reinforcements, and they decide to attack, and they attack really well. They drive back the Confederates who were busy plundering quite a bit. They do well. They drive back Confederates, but they get reinforced, and there's a little seesaw, and then they eventually start moving backwards. At one point, and it's interesting, some of the officers, and there's one point that McClernand told them. Well, he says they told in his battle report tells them, well, I told the 45th to hold here, but then to start retreating. And the officers of the 45th were like, he didn't tell us any of that. But cool leadership from Johnny Smith, and Lachlan Smith, the major. Jasper Maltby got hurt with a terrible wound at Donelson, so he's not there. Cooley got them out. They almost got surrounded by both cavalry and infantry, but got out of it. And at one point, and they keep retreating, fighting well, but they're running out of ammunition. At one point, the Confederates are, charging again at them, and one of the junior officers starts freaking out and says, what are we going to do? We don't have any bullets. And Smith is calm and says, it'll be okay. And right then, I think the divisional, somebody from divisions brings up a bunch of ammunition, and they're able to rearm and continue their fight, get into Grant's defensive line as the day closes. And so they take, I know at one point, I think I looked at it from the Illinois records, they had the 5th or 7th, very, very high end number of dead and wounded. They didn't have that many captured, but from just the dead and wounded in action, a very high number of men wounded. But they survive, they fight well the next day, they end up in their camp. All their Sibley tents are bullet ridden, all their belongings are gone. One guy laments the loss of the picture of his girlfriend and his Bible. And because they had experienced Donelson, all the dead, from both armies are all around their camp, and they lament the loss of their comrades, but they're able to go to sleep. Well, one lieutenant, I'm sorry, he was a sergeant at the time, John Jones, he missed Donelson because he had measles. He didn't leave with the army when they left Chicago, and he recuperates, gets down there, hadn't seen war, and doesn't even want to sleep on the ground. That's too barbaric. He sleeps on a wagon tongue, he said, and he was horrified at the death, and he just hadn't been initiated into the carnage of the war. And of course, the next day they've got to bury all the bodies, gather all the horses the next day and burn them, dead mules, and that's really, I think, their true bloodying. And that chapter, Bloody Not Broken, as I titled it, because they weren't broken. They lost a lot. They were down to 400 men, 350, something to that effect, just like most regiments after a couple battles, and ready to carry on. So that they didn't like Halleck's very slow move to Corinth. They did not like that at all. But they get chosen to do a lot of the skirmishing and some heavy skirmishing as they get close to Corinth. And Logan is, that's the first time I think they were under Logan's direction, and he praises the work of the regiment, and that was kind of the first time Logan said, hey, they're going to do what I tell them to do. And so and then they get dispersed and all of that, and then Vicksburg comes along. So they definitely got bloodied, and they definitely fought well, but I think it's a story that a lot of people don't read about when you read all the books on Shiloh, just on that first day, because of everything, just the hornet nest, and the work to build the defenses, and all of that, and the death of Sidney Johnston, and you hear all these, every book seems to focus on all of that. They don't really focus on, hey, who are the regiments that really helped stem the tide to give Grant the time? And of course the Hornets, all the men at the Hornets Nest did, but there were others. And I think I shine a little bit light on that, as far as
Prentice
compared to
spent a
other books.
lot of time trying to sort of justify his stand at the Hornets Nest, so
Right,
it
right,
really gets a lot of PR,
right.
and so that sort of hijacks a lot of the memory there. And
Kind
then
of a Pyrrhic, surrender, really. Yeah, they did give a lot of time, but what if they would have retreated and had more men, and been able to, a better defense, maybe? Who knows, right? But yeah, he was an early hero, right, of Shiloh.
Just ask him. Just ask
Yeah,
him.
yeah, exactly.
Another thing a lot of people don't realize, the earliest historian for the park was a veteran from one of the Iowa regiments that made his stand in the Hornets Nest. So as he's mapping out the battlefield and kind of telling that early story, he's giving a lot of emphasis to that too, because it's like, look how awesome me and my buddies did.
Yeah.
So again, it overshadows some of the work that allows Grant to get into the position, like the 45th Illinois takes part in.
Well, there's a funny story. So after the war, and I'm not sure, it might have been some well, I can't really say festivities. I believe it was people were gathering in Galena when Grant died, after the war, and Johnny Smith's there, and he was one of the few, he wasn't really a political general, but civilian, who get all the way up to major general. After the war, he becomes a colonel in the army, fights in the West against the Indians for a couple of different regiments. And after all of that, and he retires, he's back there, and he's talking to Crummer and Rowley, who are both involved with county government, and the justice department, or courts there. And they're talking about Shiloh and some of the accounts of Shiloh, and Johnny Smith's like, I read all these accounts, and I wonder if I was even there, because they didn't really talk about their work, the work on the northern side of the right flank of the Grant's army. So and that's history, right? Who writes it first?
Yeah.
It gets there.
So one of the things that I like, speaking about writing history, one of the things I really like about your book that I think is so successful is, we hear these stories about, about Shiloh, about Donaldson, the March to Corinth, but you really do a really nice job of giving voice to that from the soldier's perspective, and really kind of capturing really what it's like to be in the ranks with these guys as they're going through that, and seeing it from that soldier's point of view. I think it's a super successful part of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I really tried to focus on that, because one of my early lessons at grad school was, don't write about great white men, don't write about the generals, don't write all of that. Focus on the little guy. And you can't really say common soldier, right? Because everybody wants to say common soldier. Well, there's no common soldier, but write about the men who did the hard work, and volunteered for little or no pay. Relatively speaking, maybe not worth what, obviously most soldiers never, get paid for what they're really doing for their country. But I also felt like I had to give voice to what do they feel about the Emancipation Proclamation? What do they feel about black soldiers? What do they feel about the Southerners? And then there's mix, of course, with most, but I think like most men, hey, they didn't know anything about slavery, growing up in Illinois. There were some Southerners, I think McPherson, James McPherson, in Battle Cry of Freedom, talks about the butternuts, right? The people from the middle South, northern part of the South, that moved to the Midwest, and there was a lot of butternuts in Galena. But the only really contingent that votes Democrat up there, but they didn't know anything about slavery. They didn't know anything about real Southerners, and And at first they buy some food from some of the slaves while they're at Pittsburgh's Landing and at Shiloh. But they also first see slaves when they're on the Pinhook mission, which Grant again says, "Hey, 45th, and hey, Major Smith, leave this attack, go get me some bacon." And they learn, and it's really unclear if they were in Alabama, but it kind of sounds like very southern Tennessee or northern Alabama, where they find this 8,000 pounds of bacon, in a Confederate store. It wasn't a private store, but they also find a bunch more, at this large plantation. And Grant's instructions were, don't get any scrapes, just get in there, get out, and get back. And this is pre-Second Confiscation Act, right? So, and they were given back, what slaves they did run away, they were giving them back. And two slaves of this slave owner that they took a bunch of more bacon from run onto the ship, and Smith gets them taken off the ship because, hey, it wasn't at that time. Now, I don't think they saw any kind of brutality of slavery, but after Corinth, after they're in Jackson, Tennessee, and guarding railroads, and more of the enslaved are running off to the lines, and General Logan is still returning them. And at one point, he orders one sergeant and a bunch of men to return a bunch of these slaves. These now freed, they should be freed, right? And this is right in August, right before the Second Confiscation Act of 1862. And they return them, and they talk about dishonoring their uniforms, because right after they return it, this one slave owner is going, I'm going to show this runaway slave, ties up this teen female slave to a tree right by Logan's where he's staying at, and whips her, and people can hear her from blocks away screaming. And from that point on, they were at one point, a little bit later, they call themselves abolitionists. They were rabid abolitionists. They saw the horrors of slavery, and even though they didn't sign up to end slavery at that point, I really think that they became all in pro eventual, because there's talk, right after that came the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think they were all at for it, and I think some men probably weren't. There were bigots, there were bigots or compared to today, but I think there were, some, probably men that maybe never ever gave in, but I think the majority of men did, and they were pretty much all in for anything at that point that hurt the Confederacy, just because they saw the horrors of slavery, and they knew that taking away those, the South's workforce was going to help them in the war. So they're pretty pragmatic.
Yeah. It's interesting, because John Logan, of course, goes through a major conversion.
Yeah.
He's a staunch Democrat.
Sure.
And when he finally leads troops into the South and sees slavery firsthand, he has this huge conversion that the 45th goes through as well, kind
Oh
of
yeah.
have that same experience that they're
And the
going
fact that they were kind of interacting at Jackson with him, there's a funny story. So they take back men, and Logan goes back to the same sergeant of the 45th and has them go get these other slaves in this that were staying with this Michigan regiment. Michigan colonel calls out his whole regiment. It's like, go ahead and take them if you want. And the sergeant from the 45th, wisely backs off. He had like 7 men, and he tells Logan, and Logan's like, I think you did the right thing. And pretty much right after that, he stopped it, and he never asked, at least the 45th, ever to return slaves to their masters. And so I think it was all around there. And I think, it was Western Tennessee, a lot more slaves, a lot more slavery, a lot more plantations there. And I think, and they saw a lot of the vitriol from the they always complain about the women. The Southern women seem to be they're foul mouthed, and they really threw a lot of barbs towards the 45th and the rest of their comrades that were around Jackson. So I think that also helped. It's like, we haven't hurt you, yet. We haven't done all the horrible things that your government's going to tell you that we're going to do, but it didn't matter. And I think at that point there were, like I said, rabid abolitionists. I think at one point Maltby goes, everybody in the Army's an abolitionist these days. So a few months later. So, and they're involved some scraps there around Jackson at Menden and a few other places, and fight well against, Confederate cavalry. And they definitely, I don't think, liked Halleck's, occupational strategy of just guarding railroads and territory.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that they go through all that sort of experience. Then the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, and so they're already primed through their own experience to be predisposed against slavery by that point. Emancipation Proclamation comes out. You have all of these enslaved people who then go to Union lines and suddenly create these large contraband camps. And, regiments like the 45th are like now ready to do something about it.
Yes.
It's kind of interesting reading about Grant trying to figure out how to manage the logistics of all of that. But like,
Oh yeah, especially all around Milliken's Bend and all
yeah,
around, as he's trying to get at Vicksburg, right? And there's all those contraband camps, and they're starting to develop the black regiments, and some of the runaways are bringing horses and mules, and they kind of have their own cavalry units, to help protect the contraband camps and all of that. So it's interesting. It's really interesting, kind of seeing their change, and how they quick. And I was doing some talks and doing some readings up in Springfield, in my hometown, just recently, and they're very pragmatic. They were very flexible change in mind, and whereas most men weren't very educated, very few men, a handful, maybe being college educated or at least were in professional, role jobs before the war. They were very common sense, smart, very just ready to do what it took, and they weren't stodgy, they weren't closed minded, they weren't they were going to take on what it took, and take on whatever act and they were for. So.
yeah. So the Vicksburg campaign eventually gets underway, and they're involved, as you said, throughout the kind of inland campaign. Once they finally do get across the river in May, um, probably their biggest claim to fame, of course, is leading the charge there against the Third Louisiana Redan. Is there another moment during the Vicksburg campaign that really stands out to you as a place where these guys really shone or really learned an important lesson?
Interesting. I think at Raymond, because it was mostly the third division there, 17th Corps, that did a lot of the fighting in Raymond. And Raymond's not a huge battle. When I just finished Lincoln's Lieutenant by Sears, and you just see the size and the number of just these cataclysmic battles, right? Every 3 or 4 months. And Shiloh was like that for them. I think the whole campaign of Vicksburg might have been like that, but much smaller battles. But they're attacking. They get pushed back, when they're faced with a counterattack. But Smith was a good, he learned his craft and had one of the regiments kind of situated to protect their flanks. And at one point, they take a couple volleys from a couple of Confederate regiments, and if it had not been for Smith's placing of this reserve regiment to protect their flanks, who knows, they could have suffered quite a bit of casualties. And they said, although it was a short battle, he said it was as hot as anything that they had been in. And I think it just kind of helped prepare them further, to Champions Hill, to the what they had to do in attacking at Vicksburg, and then eventually at the crater. I think that was a good point. I think even farther back at when they're guarding the railroads and they get broken up to guard these different stations along the railroad south of Jackson, and they've got 150 men, and then they get some reinforcements, but they're fighting 500 plus cavalry, Confederate cavalry, that are raiding and trying to break up the railroad. I think it's like, a situation like that where they relied upon themselves. One company gets captured, and they're 10-1 outnumbered, and they hold out. But their junior officers, a couple of the officers had just been promoted to captain right before that point, and he calmly has them build, hay bale fortifications, and they held off this much larger force. And at one point, there was only 5 men in this one blockhouse, and held off over 100 cavalrymen for over a couple of hours. And supposedly the Confederates were really irked the fact that these 5 men had protect them, and they get captured. And luckily, at that time, they were being paroled and exchanged. But then at Menden, they're outnumbered quite a bit, and they were very calm. and were able to hold there for battle until they got some additional resources. So I think it was all those experiences, and then when they're really, they're not a part of an army, they're not fighting with a bunch of their comrades, they're very exposed out there. Served them well as well, especially when later in the war, when they're going far and wide to get foraging, and they're again very exposed out there by themselves. I think that just helped them, greater confidence and just a willingness to, hey, we'll take this on. We've been here before.
So their claim to fame, or obviously the story you told a little earlier about where they attacked the Third Louisiana Redan at Vicksburg, and um, instrumental in the construction of Logan's approach. They've got mining experience, so they're digging the mine,
Right.
and playing an important part of that. And people sort of forget that there was a mine involved there. They sort of
Well,
think
it
about,
wasn't in the Eastern Regiment. It wasn't in the East.
that's right.
There wasn't as much press, and there wasn't as much, just poor command, and drunkenness command. There wasn't any of that. But it got, a lot of notice. And then funny, after the war, they had to defend their roles, right? The other regiments are writing, in all the publications with all the Grand Army of the Republic, and they're trying to keep, they're keeping their name in there, and they've had to defend. Hey, no, we were the first to attack, and no, we were the ones that led the army in after Vicksburg is captured, and really defend their honor. Fighting with words is how I titled my last chapter a little bit. That they weren't done. They weren't done fighting for the country, or at least fighting. Now they're fighting for their own reputation, right, and their own history.
Yeah, yeah. And for folks who aren't familiar with that story, when the mine gets dug, the Confederates try some counter mines, can't
Right.
find them. So the commander in the Redan actually backs the Louisianans up a couple hundred yards, digs in sort of a second defense.
Second line of fortifications, yeah. Second trench.
So, and then they hide behind there. The mine
Right.
blows up, and in come the 45th, and the Confederates are able to come from this second line and kind of come up and meet him. And it's
Well,
only a front of just a few dozen yards wide. I mean, it's a
yes,
super
yes.
confined front.
Maybe 50, 60 feet wide, 10 feet, and they're fighting uphill, and slippery, just because of the pulverization of the dirt and everything from the explosion of the mine. It's slippery, especially gets more slippery with blood, and they're fighting uphill, very small, only fit maybe 60 to 80 men in there. And like you said, and I guess fortunate for the Confederates, the explosion opens up a wall to that kind of second trench line. And so Confederates can get right in there, and they brought in a howitzer, cannon. They can fight with their, their rifles and with the bayonets, and they're firing downhill, and and the 45th, and then all the successive regiments that that replaced them during the 20, I think it was 20 hours or so of fighting, goes into the 26th of June. They're having to charge uphill, and saved them a little bit is that a lot of the Confederates kind of fire, because they're firing downhill, fired high, but it didn't save them from the lighted shells and the grenades that are being thrown back and forth. One man is catching some of the grenades, realized that if they hit the ground, they explode, and he was catching these live shells, throwing them back, to explode on their owners. It's pretty vicious, and again, just take Petersburg and shrink it down in size, but no less barbaric, right? No black soldiers like at Petersburg. So, there's a lot of things that made Petersburg and much more of a sensational story. But yeah, in the crater there, and they fight. And immediately when they rush in, Major gets killed, bullet to the head immediately. Now Lieutenant Colonel Lockton Smith gets hit with multiple bullets. One lodged in his brain. He would live on for a couple days, pain-free, but talking about willing to die for his Union. So, boom, Major is dead. Colonel is out of action, seriously wounded, mortal wound, and now Colonel Maltby is helping to put these. They decided they can't break through. They can't get enough men to force the break through. So they get the pioneer troops start bringing in these, the big railroad ties, and so they're helping to put these railroad ties up. And just as they're getting that last railroad tie put in, Maltby's right there, and he's already been wounded a few times, minor wounds. Gets that last huge, railroad timber up. Confederate fires a howitzer cannon right there. He gets burned and bruised by the cannonball, plus all the huge splinters, and the doctor afterwards, like, I can't even count the number of wounds, right? And so he's out of action. And so their whole command staff pretty much is gone. They lose, the most men of any regiments are there. They fight for quite a while, a couple hours. They get replaced. Eventually, Hickenlooper, the chief engineer for the Corps, who, determined how far to dig the mine in. And of course, he made a mistake, and his mistake wasn't really out of incompetence. He just didn't have experience, and they just didn't build it far enough west. But he eventually they decide, let's bring the men back, and they build a parapet. And they fight from there all the way for a couple more days. But the 45th did return, and before that parapet was built, and fought again. So again, a lot of regiments fought in it, but the 45th definitely took the brunt. I want to say that they had over a fifth of all of the losses, and they suffered something like 60 casualties just in that one fight. And I think they had maybe 350 men at the time, so a good number was lost. And in Logan, there's that passage that's in there about how Logan was lamenting, and he's like, they're killing my best men, because all the 45th are, after the first time, they've been relieved, and they're bringing all their wounded back, to the lines to rest. And Logan is just beside himself. He can't, Grant won't let him, McPherson won't let him retreat. And Crummer loved Grant. I think he, like most, many in the Union did, right? From the war onwards, right? Loved him to death, but he really didn't like the fact of the decision to keep fighting for over a day, in the hellhole, they called it, right, into that crater. So really moving. When I was doing a couple readings a couple weeks ago, I just can't help myself get choked up, especially when that whole passage there that Crummer writes about. So it's you get so close to the topic, it's hard sometimes, when you know that they're being sacrificed, and you don't know these men, they're born 200 years before you, or 100 years before you were born. So but I guess that's part of maybe the love of being a historian and writing on these men.
Yeah. Tell me a bit more about Wilbur Crummer, because he's the guy that when I was doing research on the Third Louisiana Redan attack, his account immediately sort of rose to the surface, and so I
Sure.
read about this regiment through him,
Right.
and his account is so good. I've kind of followed him before and after the attack at Vicksburg, because his writing is really good. He's got a great account.
And he's
Tell
just an
who
18-year-old kid. He's just an 18-year-old kid. I don't know his educational level back then, what how far many grades, but again, a very stalwart patriot. Serves, fights well, rises from a private all the way up to first sergeant for the company. Um, survives the attack. He's there. One of his best friends. They're fighting in this northwest corner of the crater, and they've been catching bullets from three sides. One of his best friend, he tells him to get down, and he immediately gets shot. Right, his buddy dies. Bullet to the head. He survives all of that. They're all resting. Afterwards, it's July 1st. They don't know how long the siege is going to go. And at the Shirley House, which is still there today, if people go to the Vicksburg National Military Park, they still call it the White House, or the Shirley House is still there. And if you see Ken Burns' special, and even the special on Grant, the three series documentary on Grant that the History Channel did a few years ago, they show that picture of the White House, and they show these lean-to camps on this ravine. Well, that's the 45th and the rest of their brigade mates. That's their camp right there. Although Burns, and I think even the Grant special, they all say, when they're talking about how the people of Vicksburg are digging into the ground, they all show the Shirley House, and I'm like, no, it's not it. That's outside of Vicksburg. But anyway, it was interesting. So the house is saved. Originally, the Confederates are going to blow up the house because they're retreating, and they know that the house is blocking their fire. but I guess the explosive charge didn't go off, and then Mrs. Shirley is waving this flag to the Union men, don't fire on the house, don't fire on the house. And so they came over the agreement that they wouldn't shell the house, but they didn't say anything about rifle fire. And so at one point, the 45th officers were using the basement as their lodging until a cannonball inadvertently hits the house, and they luckily survive, and they make a quick dash. Anyway, Crummer, he's first sergeant. He's doing a bunch of paperwork in the back, kind of screened in porch in the back of this house, and they've been doing it through the whole. I guess it must have been safe. He wouldn't have done it through the whole siege. And Confederate bullet comes through, crashes through his lung, and he thinks he's going to die. He's praying to God, let me live, and I'll glorify you the rest of my days. He's remembering his good and bad deeds of his life. His best friend, who he writes about in his book, helps him they take him back to the doctor there says, hey, it's a mortal wound, but they take him back to a hospital a few miles back from the front. Doctor's like, hey, I can't do anything about him. I only have room for people I can save. Put him under this tree. He survives for 48 hours under this tree. His buddies helping them out. Survives a very painful examination. His ribs broken, but he survives. And one of the neat things that you don't find in Crummer's book, very little, but you find out, some of the other sources, that this one soldier that had been wounded in the head at Donelson and suffers from that wound. He survived, but he suffers from that wound the rest of the war. At one point, he was the bugler, for the regiment, but it hurt his head too much, and then he goes back and starts working in the hospitals, and he takes care of Crummer to the point where he survives. And of course, he's discharged for his wound. He can't fight anymore. He goes back home. His parents have to take care of him for at least a couple years, and that wound finally heals. Well, he gets into government, and he becomes the clerk of the circuit court there with Rowley, who was on Grant's. It was in the 45th. Is on Grant's staff throughout the rest of the war. I think he was the judge of the circuit court, and so they're together. And Grant comes back, and they're talking. At one point, this is when Grant was being talked about to be nominated for a third term after he's been already out of office for I think for 4 years, and he's friends with Grant, so he's involved there. Eventually, he moves. He was married at one point. I think his wife dies. He gets remarried. They move to Chicago, and for the rest of his life, he works there in a company, and he does education. He starts giving lectures on the war to kids and other people around in the northern suburbs of Chicago, and he writes his book. But he's also hugely, I would say, nobody was bigger than him, not only in fighting with words and defending the service of the 45th, but also of honoring the 45th when the Vicksburg National Military Park gets first put together in the early 20th century. And he also leads the fundraising for a plaque for Major McLaughlin Smith's widow comes down, and they honor him with the plaque there. And he helps the director of the park lay out, here's where our camps were, here's where the trenches were, here's because over the years, because they fight. If one thing that I talked very little about most people, they did build another mine underneath the fort, and they blow it up on July 1st. But Grant, and that's not worth it, not worth the death, and so they don't charge in. But the fort is pretty much run down, and they lay it all out. They put the plaques out there and all of the words to make sure that the service of the 3rd Division and of the 1st Brigade and all of the 45th and the rest of their comrades is honored, with all the plaques there. So, he really cared about making sure that the history of the regiment was, kept there. So,
yeah. How does the 45th ride out the rest of the war?
So they rest and recuperate. Some men go on furloughs back to a lot of the wounded men get to go back on furloughs and recuperate back in Galena and the rest of their hometowns. They're really just on guard duty, not too much going on around Vicksburg. They go on the Canton raid, which was the last time that Jasper Maltby, led the regiment. Just a raid, just kind of a lot of destruction, kind of even a precursor to the Meridian Raid. But then eventually they re-enlist, they become a veteran regiment. Supposedly there was a lot of celebrating once the rest of the brigade becomes veteran status. They didn't really mention drinking too much, but insinuated that. Anyway, they go on their furlough. I'm sorry, they take part on the Meridian Raid. They get chosen to smash up this one bridge south of the main railroad line with their brigade. They have a new brigade commander, and at this point, Lieutenant Colonel Selby he rose up through the ranks and replaced Maltby as the first time. And I think Dewar is actually doing more. Major Dewar, he again rose up through the ranks. But anyway, they get chosen to lead this attack on some Confederate cavalry that were at the bridge that they were there to destroy. Do well, lose more men than other regiments, but fight well again and are commended by their brigade commander. They get to Meridian. After that, after it's pretty much destroyed, they return home. They're doing foraging just like the rest of the soldiers, and they get back to Canton, Mississippi. They're there destroying more railroad equipment and the railroad around Canton. They get sent on a foraging mission, and over half the men get captured. And of course, at this time, they're not being exchanged and paroled, and they get sent to Andersonville. And one man survives, is able to escape Andersonville, but the other 4 all die there.
Wow.
And I did a little bit of just calculations about how many men were captured in Sherman's relatively small raid compared to the Grant's inland campaign. Once they land and fight all the way to Vicksburg, and the number of men captured is just the percentage is just much higher, even though the army is much smaller. The number of men, and a lot of them, their fate wasn't great, right? Because they get sent to not fun places. And so I noticed that, so they're there in Meridian, they go back on furlough, they meet up, and then they take a boat into Tennessee again, from Cairo, and join the Atlanta campaign, march all the way across Alabama, and they get to they reach Sherman's army, and they get to the Etowah Bridge, and them and Iowa regiment get left there to guard the bridge. And of course, this bridge was partially destroyed by the retreating Confederates, and Sherman needed that bridge because it was the only railroad supplying his campaign. And that some of them were very disappointed that they don't get to join in the fighting. Well, once they hear about their brigade, and they're at the crux of the fighting there in the final battles to the north of Atlanta, and their brigade mates suffer quite a bit in that battle, lose a lot of men. And they lost some men to some Confederates, when they're on guard duty. Again, they're a small group of men, and especially the outward posts where they have maybe 5 or 6 men, and they're getting fired on by 30 or 40 cavalry, and a couple of men do get killed. One man loses his life from drowning, so there's other ways they could die. But they also start foraging quite a bit, and it's interesting how industrious some of the men were, baking pies, going on hunt for blueberries and baking pies. And it's interesting, and it's also you get a lot of the replacements. In 1864 there, a new doctor and a couple other men that luckily took the place of some of Crummer's accounts, and also Luther Cowan. So Luther Cowan's another man that great letters back to his family and other accounts, and he dies in the May 19th attack at Vicksburg immediately, leading the regiment that day. So luckily other men joined and wrote quite a bit. So they're there. They fight. They guard Etowah successfully. The bridge there. They do more guarding in Marietta and other places. Do well, even though again they're fairly exposed. Land is captured. They're close enough to see all the destruction and everything happening in Atlanta as Sherman's trying to get ready his army to leave. And then they take part in the March to the Sea. Do well, very little fighting, even when they get down close to Savannah. But it's not they're actually fed well, fed better at other times. They're finding enough food, but once they get down there, it's pretty cold. A lot of flooded areas around there because, of course, the Confederates were trying to keep Savannah, um, and it was a situation where at Vicksburg, Union artillery outduels much, more guns, heavier guns. So there, Vicksburg, the Union had the advantage in artillery. Well, they didn't bring much artillery on that, campaign because they're traveling light, and so it was pretty dangerous, until they got their trenches and all of that. Well, they thought they were going to have to go in, but of course, the Confederates pull out before a major attack happens, and they're there briefly in Savannah over Christmas, New Year's of 1864 and 65, and then they immediately head up to South Carolina. Their second to last real fighting happens at Pocatello Bridge there. They get chosen to lead. They're the lead skirmishers as their division and then corps they need to capture that bridge in order to then get to the railroad and tear up the railroad there. And again, they're chosen to lead, and pretty fierce fire they receive there. And then the interesting part is that the fighting's there, and they dig in, and they can kind of hear things, and the general of the division was like, actually, I don't want to say it was Howard, but the general is like, goes to the 45th. Hey, I need somebody to go check out if they're really gone. And Private Bellinghall gets chosen, and he basically has been leading his company as a sergeant at that point. He had started as a 16-year-old drummer, fights well at Donelson, even though he's a drummer, fights well. He even gets a furlough home at Vicksburg because Grant sees him help turn this cannon around at the top of Champion Hill and fire it on the retreating Confederates. And there's a really great story about finding his fellow Galenian men, Rowley and Rollins, there. And so that's a great story. But he's leading basically all the way from Atlanta the rest of the war as a now 21-year-old, first sergeant, leads the company. The officers are either wounded, sick or what on duty. And Major Dewar says, hey, come on, man, come on, Sergeant, I need you to go in there. And it's just interesting of him to try to run the last 50 yards to to this fort right as the last Confederates leaving. So that's kind of they fought a little bit in North Carolina, but not too bad there. But that was kind of their last major kind of leading the attack, so to speak. They fight all the way through South Carolina. I mean, they march all the way through South Carolina. Little action, but so suffering still. It was the same old story, foraging. Some days they ate well, and some days all they had was coffee to eat for the whole day. They make it into North Carolina. They're there when Lee when Lee has to leave Petersburg and surrenders. They're there when Lincoln gets, they learn the news of Lincoln's assassination. And then, of course, Johnston surrenders. And the interesting thing I learned is that, Sherman's telling his army commanders, I want a nice, easy march to through Virginia and to D.C. And of course, that doesn't happen. And his subordinates are seeing whose men gets to D.C. first. And the 45th survived, it would know, but there was a lot of men who actually either died from exhaustion or had to fall out because they were just being pushed, too hard. It was just, these two, I think it was Logan and I can't remember the other general, just wanted ego comes into play and wanted their men to reach first. But anyway, they make it to DC. Some of the men go into DC to watch the Army of the Potomac march the first day. They're getting prepared to march the next day, and they realize that they joke that the only black that they really have on, they don't have any black polish to polish their boots because their boots are all pretty much worn. The only black is their faces, sunburned faces are all black from all the marching they did. But they were very prideful of their work they did. And again, they didn't fight in some of these huge cataclysmic battles in the East as much as the Army of the Potomac did, but they did some serious hard marching, hard service. And they were very proud marching down. And I put in there a few accounts that, hey, the men of the West, the Western armies, stood proud and maybe marched better than their Eastern competitors. They stay around DC for a while. I think there was a lot of, it was insinuated there was a lot of, let's say, competition between the two armies. Some of it was pretty violent at times, I'm sure. Some fighting, fist fighting, etc. They get on a train, then a boat to Louisville, Kentucky, and unfortunately stay there for over a month. And they were getting pretty irritated that, like a lot of the soldiers were, that they weren't being, discharged, right away. And so they stay there a month. They finally get discharged July 12th, 1865. Make it home to celebrations like most men, and then they're there to try to pick up their lives. And some men do. Bellinall goes to California. His mom and his sister, his mom had remarried. Sister, they go out to California. He's like, hey, where's my family? He goes out there and he petitions Grant and Washburn, and he gets a job as a night watchman to the what do you call it? The import export, the customs in San Francisco. And eventually he starts up his own import export business, and that business is still in business today. It's really amazing. I couldn't believe it when I found that out. But other men, Crummer eventually, he gets it through and gets healed. Other men do well, but some men couldn't. And one soldier, wounded pretty severely in his leg, at one point wished that they had cut off his leg, but survives, wounding from Shiloh, and does really well for himself, has a bunch of children, married, a really successful farm and other businesses, and eventually takes his own life. And there was no reason given. He, either from the lasting pain of his wound or the horrors of the war, and he couldn't get beyond it. And I don't think a lot of I grew up reading about Vietnam. I was a child of, born in 65, and you hear about post-traumatic stress, and then you hear it, of course, with the Gulf Wars. But these men did as well. But if the World War II generation didn't talk about it, well, these people really didn't talk about it. So I think that's an untold story of how many men actually did kill themselves because of couldn't get over the war and couldn't get over the horrors. So, but again, like I said, they fought well. They join up with, Grand Army of the Republic had, all throughout the war. Post-war period, Crummer's big in that. One of the men, Daniel Fish, joins up in 1864, doesn't even make it to Atlanta to join the March to the Sea, but fights with other men who were deemed not strong enough to make it that campaign. They fight well at Nashville, and then eventually rejoin the regiment in North Carolina. So even when they were a bunch of new recruits, they still fought well. Just kind of an interesting, hey, they were totally detached. So Fish becomes a lawyer and becomes a judge, pretty well-respected judge in Minnesota, and becomes head of Grand Army of the Republic in Minnesota at a very young age. And so he writes another history at I'm trying to think, 1905, I believe, way after the war. And it's funny, he even though he wasn't involved in the what made the 45th and their history, he heard the stories. He heard everything, serving in the brief time that he did with the veterans. But he goes, hey, we did what every other regiment did. We weren't anything special. Whereas the first history that was written soon after the war, does pump up their exploits. So it's interesting, 40 years after the war, how this guy, he goes, hey, we were patriots like anybody else, right? But they do that. Crummer survives, dies just a few years after both making sure that the 45th was commemorated correctly in Vicksburg, and writing his book. Dies just a few years after that. I think other notables was the fact that a couple men survived into their 90s, into the mid 30s. And I know that there was still Civil War veteran, can't remember if it was a Union or Confederate, when Omar Bradley heads up the VA when he has his first gig after the war. And there was still a Civil War veteran that was part of the Veterans, administration. So no, I don't know if anybody lasted till they're, into the 40s, but a couple men lasted to 1935. And amazing, and I kind of end it in the sense that they were just stalwart men, and they went where they were told, they fought when they were told, they never retreated, they never uh, uh, they retreated, of course, but they never ran, from an attack. They stood their ground until they were told to retreat. And I, I will defend this generation as the greatest generation. I don't know if you ever get into that with, World War II historians, but I always look at it as like, if these men didn't do what they did and then took on the additional goal of ending slavery, where would the country have been when the demands of the 20th century came about, right? And they weren't alone. The Black Americans were so integral as well, and if it wasn't for the Black Americans taking a chance and running to the Union lines, does any of the Second Confiscation Act or does the Emancipation Proclamation happen, right? So you look at it, who's involved in it, and the reason I started writing these regiments was regimental studies, or went down this path, is because so many regiments haven't been talked about, or history that was written in 1880 by one of the members, and it's a good history, but it's not complete, right? And there's so many more regiments on both sides to be brought to light as far as their service and their and the suffering that they went through in uniform.
The book is The Lead Mine Men, the Enduring 45th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Tom, it's been a pleasure to hear this story and to hear your story telling the story. So,
thank you, Chris. I really appreciate, obviously, the opportunity, and I'm a big fan of both the series and, of course, the website and all the articles, and look forward to helping out more with more great history. Maybe some Texas regiments. We'll see.
Hey, all right, very good, very
All
good.
right.
Well, if this effort is any indication, I can't wait to see what you do next. This is
Thank
fantastic.
you so much. Thank you so much. Take care.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.